Hello, everyone. Um, Sorry, I'm a couple of minutes late. I also forgot about daylight savings. So maybe not the best time to do a live stream when everyone wants an extra hour of sleep and or time zone differences are different in different countries. So I'm glad to see that there are a handful of people here. And should people show up an hour late, I will try to stay on as long as I can. Um, so it is PhD decision season, which can be both a very exciting time or a very depressing time or just a confusing, stressful time, perhaps all of the above. So I am happy to answer any questions that people have that I can answer anyway. So feel free to leave them in the chat. I will go in the order that I see them. If a lot more people show up, sometimes the chat gets a little bit fast. So if I accidentally skip your question, please feel free to leave it again. And I tried to change a setting in YouTube so that this would not be a problem, but it seems that I did not succeed. If people left questions or comments in the chat before today, they appear to now be gone. I do not know how to see them anymore, but I did see one question yesterday when I happened to pop onto the page, and so I don't remember who asked it, but I will try to answer that first. And if you left a question earlier in the week since I posted the page for this live stream, please feel free to leave it again. And if you are not here, leave it in the comments of this video and I will be happy to answer it in the comments for you. So the question that I'm trying to remember, this may not be exactly correct, that someone left yesterday or the day before. They were asking about having a gap in their resume. I think it was 3 or 4 years. And I can't remember if there was a particular reason for it, but basically their question was, is this going to impact my chances of being admitted into a PhD program? Is this some kind of red flag if you have a gap in your resume? So a reason that I can imagine that happening might be you graduate from college and it takes you a little while to find a job. So maybe you have a couple of year gap there, or maybe um, uh, maybe you take some time off to raise children, or you take some time off to do whatever you need to do, or maybe there's a job that you did that you don't think you want to put on your resume. In any case, I would not worry too much about this. Gaps in people's resumes happen for all kinds of reasons. I personally think that it would be inappropriate to ask the reason for a gap unless someone volunteers that information. But if it's something that you think people might wonder about and you want to address it in some way, I would say feel free to, but do not feel obligated. I give the same answer. Sometimes people ask about like if it's some kind of red flag in PhD applications, if you're a little bit older, or if you've been out of school for a while. I don't think so at all. Honestly, some of the best PhD students I have seen have been people who were a little older, who worked for a while, for example, before coming into a PhD program. It's good to have different kinds of life experiences, but also it tends to mean that you're a little more mature, that you know how to be in a work environment, and so I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I believe it was the same person who also asked something that I've seen 2 or 3 different times also in my in comments on my videos this application season, which is basically this thing is bad about my application, say a GPA. my GPA is bad, or my GRE scores are bad, or I don't have a lot of research experience, whatever it is, this bad thing. And then the question is, can this good thing make up for it? So, like, my GPA is bad, but I have really good research experience. Will that make up for it? Um, my GRE scores are bad, but my GPA is amazing. Can that make up for it? I don't have much research experience, but I have, right? So most people are going to have strengths and weaknesses in their applications for grad school. That's just how it goes. That's going to be the case for almost everyone. There's going to be some good things and some bad things. And the answer to can X make up for Y in the general sense is always yes. Like, strengths can always make up for weaknesses. Now, how will those particular things be weighed by in your particular situation or for any particular program? I certainly can't tell you that, but I can say in the general sense that yes, strengths make up for weaknesses. All right. Okay, good. There are some questions in the chat too. So someone's asking if I can explain in detail the process of selecting PhD candidates after we submit the application. Unfortunately, I cannot. And the reason that I cannot is because this will be different everywhere. Um, Even at my university, I see sort of two different processes because I'm in information science, but I'm also like I have an affiliate appointment in computer science, and so I'm on their faculty mailing list, and so I see how they do things, and they do things differently than we do things, and that's in very similar fields in this in the same university. Um, so I can't really answer this question. I mean, I guess I can try to tell you like some ways that I know things. So some programs, for example, will have an admissions committee, and they are going through all of the applications and making decisions. Sometimes they're vetting things to go to the rest of the faculty. Sometimes they're making the decisions entirely themselves. Sometimes there isn't really an admissions committee, and it's very sort of individualized to specific advisors. Sometimes students are admitted to work with an advisor, and so unless there are some significant concerns from other members of the faculty, if an advisor wants to admit a student, they essentially can. Sometimes that's not how that works. Sometimes for exceptionally large programs that get a huge number of applications, they will do some kind of algorithmic vetting first. I have no idea how that works. I've never seen that done before, and I don't know what kinds of things might go into that algorithm, though of course I could guess. Um, uh, and I have no idea how common that is. And I would also certainly hope that there's always more to an application review than numerical kinds of things. And I suspect that the vast majority of the time that is the case. But yeah, unfortunately, all I can tell you, I guess, is that in every for everything that I have personal knowledge of, applications are vetted uh, holistically, and a person is reading them. Um, but of course, I can't guarantee that that's the case everywhere. Um, all right. Next question is how do I write a research proposal if I'm trying to do a PhD in a totally different area? For example, switching from finance to engineering. Um, so I'm not sure if you're saying you're in a PhD program in engineering now and trying to write a research proposal, in which case that would be a very different kind of question. I'm gonna assume, due to what questions at this time of year tend to be, that you're that you're saying you're applying for a PhD program that requires a research proposal. So as I've said here a few times before, I don't have personal experience with this. My understanding is that this is more common outside of the United States, particularly in Europe, for an actual research proposal to be part of the application. That's not very common here, and so I don't have any experience with this, so I don't know what they tend to look like or how they tend to be evaluated. So please keep that in mind with what I am about to say. I guess I would answer this question given what I just explained. The same way that if you had asked, like, how do I write a statement of purpose if I'm switching areas, which is a very common kind of question. Um, and in that case, I tend to say that the thing that's important is to have some kind of story for that switch. Like, why are you interested in this thing now? I mean, in the same way, I mean, honestly, this would be the same in any circumstance. Like, you always need a why. Why, this field, why this research area. And so if you're changing fields, I guess that just becomes a little less obvious, maybe, in which case it's good to explain that. Um, and then I guess the other thing is that just that you should make sure that you understand, I guess, the norms of research proposals and whatever your new field is. Okay. Again, please feel free to leave questions because I am already at the bottom, and I've never ran out very early before, so I'm not sure what happens. All right, next question then. Um, Assuming you made a mistake on your CV during an application, data-wise, would this suffice? For instance, a paper submitted for review and inserted the wrong date. Um, so I'm not sure what the would this suffice is asking. Um, but I'll just say in general about mistakes. If you make a mistake in your application, you know, is this a deal breaker, or is this going to be a really big deal? Um, Typically no. I mean, I guess it depends on the kind of mistake, but an example that I often give is that every single year, um, we get at least one application that either has the wrong, like in the statement of purpose, has the wrong university listed, or the wrong faculty or something like that. So it's clearly a copy paste problem, right? Like, this happens every year with at least one application. Um Usually more than one. And, like, we know that you're applying to more than one university. I suppose one could argue, and I did say this in one of my videos, that, like, you should try to be as careful as possible about this kind of thing, just because, if anything, this might suggest, like, a lack of attention to detail. But on the other hand, like, people make mistakes, and you're doing a lot of these, and it's a lot. And I personally would not hold it against someone if they have one copy paste error and accidentally put the name of the university in their statement of purpose, particularly if they then have listed, like, the correct faculty and that sort of thing. Then it's clearly just a mistake and you ignore it. If you, like, submitted the wrong statement of purpose to the university, so it also has, like, the wrong faculty and that sort of thing listed in it, in that case, in our program, we would email that person and say, hey, it looks like you submitted the wrong statement of purpose. Do you want to give us the correct one? Now, I will say we can do that because we don't get a ton of applications, like usually about 100, less than 100. So it's not a huge burden to do that for a couple of applications a year, right? If this is a program that gets 1,000 applications, they're almost certainly not going to do that. So you do need to be as careful as possible about that kind of thing. But even then, like, we've admitted a student before where they put the wrong university in, in the statement of purpose. So it's not like a death knell. Now, you're asking about things like, has the wrong date for a paper on your CV. I mean, I find it highly unlikely that anyone would notice that. Like, how would someone even know that it was wrong or notice it? And if they did, like, and like, they're gonna just assume it was a typo or something, right? Like, this is not a big deal. I mean, unless you have mistakes that could be interpreted as you actively misleading about something, right? So, like, you don't want to put, like, the only thing that I can think of that would be a big deal for a mistake on a CV would be, like, you have a paper that's under submission and you don't put that it's under submission, or like you somehow like you put the journal but you don't say that it's under submission so it looks like it's published. Like that could be interpreted as you're intentionally lying to make your CV look better. And even, and so I guess I would be very careful about that kind of thing. But that's the only circumstance in which I could think that that would like actively work against you. And if somehow you accidentally did something like you accidentally said that a paper was published when it wasn't, it might be worth like reaching out to the program and like sending a correction just to make sure that it's not interpreted as like you're lying about something. But something like having the wrong date is not, I can't imagine that mattering at all. All right, here we go. Next question. I've worked for 5 years as a game designer on my own indie projects, which weren't published. Can you count them as work experience? Interesting question. I don't, so, okay. When you say, okay, so here's the thing. When you say count, I assume you mean like, where would you list this on a CV or a resume, right? Like, there's no, does this count as this or does this count as this? And in a way, it doesn't matter because as long as you're accurate, you can write anything that you want, right? So on your CV, as long as however you choose to put this on there, it's accurate and you say exactly what it is. I mean, if you want to be like exceptionally careful, I guess what you would do is make a game development section on your CV and then list it there. And if you like, wanted to be exceptionally like, I can't imagine anyone even caring that much, but like you could, put in brackets like currently unpublished or something like, right? Like in a way, I don't think that, people ask me the same thing about research experience. Like, does X count as research experience? And like, there's not any counting, right? Like no one is counting. It's not, I've never heard of a PhD application where it has like specific things and it's like list all of your research experience in this box. And then I guess you'd have to worry about it maybe, but even then you can like, as long as you describe it accurately, it shouldn't really matter. So that's how I feel about things like CVs too. Like, does it count? It doesn't matter, just be accurate. Why is there a lot of subjectivity in PhD admissions in the US and India? It's basically if you get good scores, you get the admission directly. I don't know because I don't know anything about how India works. I would say that I'm very glad that it's as subjective as it is. And this is true for even PhD programs. I find that a little surprising. I mean, master's admissions tend, and law school also, I think tend to be a little more numeric. When I was applying for law school, at least, there was all of this advice, and people would even create like their own interpretations of formulas and be like, hey, plug in your GRE score, or not GRE, LSAT score, and your GPA, and we'll tell you what schools you could get it. Like someone had made one of those. I'm sure it was horribly inaccurate, but thank God it doesn't work like that. In my opinion, I think that it's really important that it's not that so yes, it's subjective, but it also means that it's holistic. Like I am fairly certain that I would never have been admitted to a PhD program if it was based only on my GRE score. And I've done pretty well. I also think that some of you may have heard me rant about this before, but I actually think that standardized tests are pretty useless when it comes to PhD admissions. Maybe they're okay for undergrad or master's or whatever, but I just don't see how standardized tests tell you anything about someone's potential as a PhD student. But I would think of it as holistic, as much as subjective. And it's necessarily subjective because there is no objective measure of PhD potential. There just isn't. There isn't a standardized test that that can do that. Your GPA also can't do that for lots and lots of reasons. And so there just isn't anything objective. So it is necessarily subjective. But what this also means, as I was getting at the very beginning of this live stream, is that strengths in your application can make up for weaknesses. That's what holistic means. And one of those strengths might be standardized test scores. And so I think that it gives a lot of people a lot of different kinds of opportunities, and that's really good. Oh, and someone said thank you, so you're welcome. um, uh, and good, yay, and also got into programs. Excellent. I have to say, I really love this time of year when I start getting like comments and emails and stuff from people who are like thanking me for my videos. Or like recently, we had our like the open house for our prospective PhD students, and a lot of them had seen my videos and thanked me for them. And so anyway, it's very nice to hear that. I appreciate it, and I really do. It makes me feel very good to think that I'm actually helping people. So yay. Next, okay, a couple of professors who are retired or transferred are still in the college websites. How can you find out? Because you're not in the USA and can't call their offices. Well, frankly, no one ever calls. If you find a phone number for my office on the internet, it is not real. I took the phone out of my office. I don't know how. I have no idea how. If anyone calls that phone number, it would not get to me. I have absolutely no desire to have a phone in my office nor to have anyone call me. I'm just, as a general rule, don't call professors. I don't know if that's more of a norm in other fields or maybe in other countries. So if a professor somewhere thinks that what I just said is crazy, please comment on this when this is posted later and tell me. But I would never call anyone. I would send an email. So here's two things that you could do. So I assume that what you're asking this because like you're going to apply for a program. You're thinking about what faculty might be the most appropriate advisor for you. And so you're looking at the list of faculty and you're researching them. And there are some people who it seems like they might be retired. Well, here's two things you can do. One, I mean, there are easy ways to know that someone's not retired or, they're still publishing, for example. So go to their Google Scholar page, go to the most recent paper they've published and look and see what their affiliation is to make sure that they haven't moved or something. And if their most recent paper was 6 years ago, then, continue investigating. You can email that professor, of course, that's low hanging fruit. Maybe they don't respond. As I've said here many times before, the number of emails that I get would absolutely blow your mind. And I know that I miss some sometimes. And then of course, the other thing you can do is email the department and ask. So every department anywhere will have some kind of like administrative email or information email or something, or they have one for admissions. Like there has to be a way to ask questions of the department. So send them an email and say, I'm applying to your program. Can you tell me you could just say in general, like, faculty listed on this website still active? Or you could ask about a particular person, of course. And so anyone in any country should be able to email people. Can I realistically manage pursuing a PhD online and an MS with monthly weekend classes simultaneously, especially while working full time? Both programs are dream picks, and any advice as well. I don't know why you. Okay. I'm struggling to imagine any situation in which you would want to do this. Maybe I'm missing something. But I don't know why you would be pursuing a master's and a PhD at the same time. Like in different programs, like even like maybe this even sounds like it might be at different universities. I think I think my advice is don't do that. Just because I can't think of any reason that you would. Like either you get into a PhD program and you do a PhD, or you get into an MS program and you do that, and then you think about getting a PhD afterwards. Yeah. I can't think of any reason why you would do that. So if I'm missing something, let me know. Let me know. um, okay. Different universities and subject areas. Oh, I st- this yep, I still can't imagine why you would do that. um Yeah, I would, if you get into, if you get into 2 things and you're trying to if you get into both of them and you're trying to decide which one you should do, or if there's a reason you would do them simultaneously, I would maybe talk to someone at both of those programs and ask them this question. Um, I mean, you say it's an online PhD program too, and I confess I don't know a lot about online PhD program. Is it legal? Um, Probably. I mean, okay, legal, like, obviously, there's not a law against it. So when you say legal, I assume you're asking, like, would you be allowed to do that? And maybe, yeah, so, like, yeah, unless the program has a rule against that, but that's so strange that I can't even imagine why you would have a rule against it, like pursuing degrees at 2 different. Anyway, I think you need to ask. Obviously, I cannot answer this question. Okay, next. Picking between 2 schools, for 2 very different programs, how should you consider post-PhD employment opportunities when making your decision? Um, and my university is one of them. Cool, cool, cool. So my question would be, how would you know what the employment okay, so yes, okay, so I guess, okay, so you say one field is very popular right now and the other isn't popular. I mean, popular is an interesting word. Uh, I assume, okay, I'm just going to interpret some things here to answer this question. When you say popular, I am assuming you mean like it's in a field where the academic job market, for example, is way better than the other field, or like just there are more jobs. Okay, so let's say, the question is, I'm interpreting your question as, when you're choosing a field to go into, not the program, but the field, should you take into account the job opportunities afterwards? Because, like, frankly, if there are many more jobs for people with a computer science PhD than there are people with an English PhD. That's just the way of the world, right? Okay. Um, so should you take that into account? I think that is entirely up to you. Well, one thing that I often say is like, um, but deciding which PhD program to choose if you have multiple options, um, is extremely personal and is going to be different for everyone. And the reason is because people's priorities are very understandably different, right? Um, uh, like, for example, location might matter a whole lot to some person. Like, it's incredibly important. Like, maybe you need to be near family, or you need to be somewhere that your partner can get a job, or maybe you have like really bad allergies and you can't live in some place that like has you like pollution. There are lots of things that you need to be somewhere where your kids can go to a good school system, right? There are lots of reasons why location could matter so much that that would be the deciding factor, where for other people, it might not matter at all, right? And then, for someone like, uh, studying the thing that you think you are most passionate about, even if you know it's going to be harder to get a job, could be more important to you. And there could be someone else who is like, my number one priority is that I can immediately get a job after I graduate, right? Those are both totally reasonable things. And it's good that you know this difference, because then you can make a decision. And I would also say that whichever program it is that you're perceiving has sort of less job opportunities, I would make sure that that's true. Like, make sure that you talk to people in that program and ask them if that is the case, right? Like, ask them about the job opportunities rather than just assuming. Um, all right, next. Someone says, you mentioned may ask what could count as research experience. Could you please give some examples? You mean give examples of research experience? Um, sure. Uh, y- okay, so the obvious thing, right? Like the low hanging fruit research experience is like you participate in a research project. Like that would be the kind of thing that one would do as a PhD student, right? So in STEM fields, this very often looks like, working in a research lab. Maybe that means it doesn't have to mean that you publish. Like it doesn't mean that you're like necessarily a co-author on a paper, but like you have participated in the research process as it looks like in your field. In STEM fields, it tends to be like, you know, being part of a lab as an undergrad or master's student or something like that. In more humanities fields, this might mean, you or actually this would be both of these. The other thing would be in any field, like you did a like research based, say, honors thesis or a master's thesis or something like that. Again, if you're in a STEM field, this might mean that you did an experiment or like an empirical research project, on your own or with other people. In humanities, this might mean that did a different kind of research project, but like maybe it resulted in writing a thesis or something like that. Maybe it's something that you did for a class that looks a lot like what research looks like in your field. I was a psychology major in undergrad, and so I had a couple of classes where like we did things that looked like graduate school research in a class. Or maybe you have an industry job where what you're doing as part of your job is the kinds of things that people in academic research in your field do, right? So I guess my answer to that question is it's doing something that looks like or is adjacent to research in your discipline, whatever that happens to look like. And I want to reiterate here, though, this is not a requirement to be admitted into a PhD program. Um, and I constantly like people don't believe me when I tell them this. Like people don't believe me when I even tell them that you don't have to be published yet to get into a PhD program. And I don't know where these ideas are coming from. Like I you can all look me up and see, where I am, where I work, what my department is, and judge for yourself I guess how good of a program it is or whatever. But I have admitted multiple PhD students over the years who have zero research experience in the way that I just described it, right? Not everyone even has the opportunity for that. Now, again, it's extremely helpful um, for um, for PhD applications. And part of the reason isn't even just like to prove that you can do it, but also to like prove that you understand what it is. Admitting a PhD student is a big commitment. And so like it's one way of illustrating that like you know what you're getting into and you know that this is what you really want. But that's not necessarily the only way to show that, right? But as I said before, does this count as something isn't really like that's not really a thing because there isn't really like no one's counting. So I don't know if that helps, but those were my thoughts to that question. All right, next question. What is the most ideal month to email professors for prospective PhD positions? So in my video about reaching out to potential advisors, which again is not like a requirement, you don't have to do this, and it's also it's more of a norm in some fields than other fields. I think I suggest like early fall. So like uh a lot of PhD applications are due in December, right? Like December 1st, December 15th, December 30th. Like I would say those are probably the most common dates, sometime in December. Ours is December 1st. Um, and so I tend to say like at least like about a month before applications are due is pretty reasonable. I tend to get people starting. I mean, I'll get people reaching out now, and then I tell them to please contact me again in the fall. But I would say like October, November is when I'm hearing the most. And ideally, like, or if you're gonna if the applications due December 1st, about 2 weeks before it starts to feel late. It's still okay, but that starts to feel a little late. And if someone emails me 3 days before the application is due, um, I actually might. I mean, I might not respond at all because frankly, that's not a reasonable amount of time to expect someone to respond to an email. Um, uh, but also it's just not help. I feel like it's not very helpful at that point, right? Like I would hope that 3 days before the deadline, you've like mostly decided like where you're applying and started writing your statement. And so it doesn't seem like it's that helpful. I also will get emails after people have submitted their applications, and that confuses me because then it's not helpful at all. Like you've already submitted it. Like why bother? Um, and this again is because, as I describe in that, video that I made about this, I see reaching out to prospective advisors as a fact-finding mission for you. Um, it's so that you can find out things like there's zero chance I'm admitting new PhD students this year, or you can find out things like, I just got this new grant, and so I'm only considering advisees who are doing work in this area. Um, or I'm on sabbatical next year and I'm not admitting, like all kinds of things that could be useful. Or yes, that's a really interesting topic area. Did you know that we just hired this brand new person who's doing exactly that? You should reach out to them instead, right? These are the kinds of things that are useful for you, and they're not useful for you 3 days before the deadline. So, but it's also not as useful to email now because I mean, like we haven't even finished our admissions for this year yet. I mean, I know how mine is shaking out already, but like for most people in our department, they don't even know if they're like how many PhD students they're going to have next year. And so they're not making decisions yet about whether they're going to be admitting for the year after that. Also, a lot of decisions on grants and stuff will come, between now and fall. And so that also might drastically change how people are recruiting or what kind of research they're doing. So I would say, if a deadline is say December 1st, 1 to 2 months before, probably not any more than 3 months before, not any later than 2 weeks before. Sorry, that was a long-winded question, but hopefully that was helpful. All right, next question. Someone's going to Michigan for a CS PhD. Excellent choice. Good people at Michigan. Make sure you check out the folks in the iSchool there. That's where all my friends are. Okay, next question. I got admission into civil engineering PhD program, but no funding. How to go about it? So I guess my question, so when you ask how to go about it, I don't know what you're asking. I don't know if you're asking, how do you survive in a PhD program with no funding? I don't know how you're asking, how do you find your own funding? Or I don't know if you're asking, how do I make a decision about whether to go there? So I will just talk around this a little bit. It is a very personal decision whether you are willing to do a PhD program without funding, right? It's gonna be different for everyone. Again, different priorities, different goals, all kinds of things that are going to be different. So I can't tell you whether or not it's an okay thing to do. Like, can you survive, like, can you do student loans? Can you get loans from other places? Are you independently wealthy? Like, can you survive? I mean, you need to be able to survive, right? So if you're going into a PhD program without funding, you need to know what that means. Like, how are you going to pay rent? And you need to figure those things out, right? Um, uh, and there's also the possibility, of course, that sometimes a student is admitted without funding, but that means that like we're not promising, but you might get it, right? This is true. So say this is very common for master's programs, and actually this is true for the master's program in our department. You might Our master's students are not admitted with funding, but sometimes we have funding, right? Sometimes um, we're so successful with research grants that we put, most of our PhD students on research assistantships, and then we need people to TA our classes, so we dip into the master's students so they get TA positions and therefore get funding, right? But it's not promised. And so if you're so one thing I would say is if you're admitted unfunded into a program and there's a possibility, don't bank on that possibility. Like if they're telling you it's not promised, they're telling you that for a reason, and you can't get mad later if you don't get it because you were assuming something that they didn't tell you. Um, but in that circumstance, you should ask them how likely it is, and also just make sure that you're prepared, to deal with not having funding. And of course, you can also ask them, like, are there external fellowships that students tend to apply to, and that kind of thing, and just weigh those odds for yourself. Um, so the question about a gap. Um, uh, okay, so someone has a gap in their resume, because of like family issues. They had to help with their family for a while. Um, Again, that like so I'll say what I said before, which is that frankly, it's no one's business why you have a gap in your resume. I don't consider that any kind of red flag personally, because there's a ton of reasons that it could be, none of which are my business and none of which reflect badly on an applicant. So you can choose to reveal this information if you want to, but I wouldn't feel obligated. Like I can't imagine a world in which that makes some kind enough of a difference that it wouldn't like that it would impact like whether someone gets to a stage in which they're talking to you, if that makes sense. Like um if you got to like an interview stage, you could decide whether to talk about that or not. But for what it's worth, I don't think that's a particular red flag. um if you hear otherwise from people and you think that it's something that you should address, then I think you could certainly mention something like that in your statement of purpose, maybe something in terms of like, you know even though you dealt with this thing, you're so passionate to get back to research, or whatever it is. But I don't ever think you have to feel obligated to reveal personal things about yourself in a PhD application. All right, next question. Um, Someone has a BA in IT and hasn't done official research nor papers. Again, I addressed this a minute ago. No problem. Again, it's not a requirement. Applied for a related PhD program, which need research experience. As a game designer, you're doing research in your field. Um, yeah. So it sounds to me. So the thing that I said before about research experience is that it is research experience is the thing that looks like research in your field. Maybe you did this in a lab. Maybe you did this by yourself. Maybe you're looking to get a PhD in game design and you designed a game. Like that seems like a really good thing to talk about in a PhD application to me. Next question. Can you talk about relations in a PhD? Can you do a PhD under your elder brother as an advisor who is in Stanford? Um, Probably not. But you don't need to ask me this. You need, your brother needs to ask Stanford this. Like, this will not be a mystery. Like, you can find out the answer to this question immediately by asking someone the rules at Stanford. My intuition is probably not. Now, it's probably not going to so you can almost certainly do a PhD in that program, but I find it highly unlikely that, in fact, like I'm like 99% confident your brother could absolutely not be your advisor. In fact, I'm 99% confident you could not take a class taught by your brother. But that doesn't mean you couldn't be in the program. My PhD program, um, there was someone who was in my program who was related to a professor. And even though their research topic was actually most related to their relative's research area, that relative was not their advisor. They had a different advisor, like for very obvious reasons, frankly. And same thing. I'm fairly certain that you couldn't take a class with them either. But anyway, you can find this out immediately. Your brothers should ask. All right. Can an online master's degree have the same weight as a real master's? I don't. I mean, when you say, okay, so I don't know what you mean by weight. Do you mean weight in terms of you getting a job? Do you mean weight in terms of getting into a PhD program? That can mean a lot of different things. And I guess my answer is it depends on the program, right? There are certainly a lot of online degree programs that are not considered as prestigious as sort of traditional programs, and there are some that are basically the same as a traditional program but are just online. So it's gonna vary. Not so there isn't a like standard answer to that. Okay, next. I got invited to several PhD programs, but one of them didn't invite me for a campus visit. Can you ask for it? Seeing the campus really matters. So this is an interesting question. Yes, you can. Okay. So not all programs have the budget to fly everyone in and put them up at a hotel for a couple of days, right? Like it's just, budgets are different. The other thing is that, I will say that for our program, we actually don't invite international students typically to our open house because we just can't afford it. We can't afford the plane tickets. Typically, it's sort of depending, but so that that kind of thing can be common. So can you ask, so and assuming you've already been admitted, yes, you can ask. What are they going to say? So, but you need to think about how you ask, because one thing you might ask is, can I come visit? In which case you should specify, like, you will pay, like it's important to you, you will find some money and come visit. They will almost certainly say yes to that. And we, would probably arrange for you to like meet with the people you needed to meet and that kind of thing. And so if you're able to do that, like, you should ask. Now, if you ask, can you fly me out? You can, the answer is likely to be no, in part because of fairness, right? So if they're not having an open house and flying everyone out, is for a reason, and it's probably money. And they can't, like, they're almost certainly not going to fly just you out because you asked and not everyone else who was admitted. You know what I mean? I guess there's some possibility that if you would be working with a particular advisor, that like maybe that advisor really, really wants to work with you and like would, look under the couch cushions and they would pay your way to come out so you can, that help you make that decision. So anyway, my answer is yes, you can ask. I would not be surprised if the answer is no. I wouldn't, but you might consider, if you've been talking to a prospective advisor already, you might ask them, and you might ask them in a sort of like, hey, I'm making this decision. I'd actually really love to see the campus. I don't know. I was wondering if there are any pathways to that. Like maybe the university has some money lying around or something like that. But again, if you're able to pay your own way, which I would not expect, but like if you were, then I think you could ask that, and that would be a very reasonable thing, and they would almost certainly say yes. Unless there's some sort of weird fairness thing. But if you're already admitted, then a campus visit isn't an interview tool, it's a recruitment tool. So yeah, anyway, the question is just, can I ask? And the answer is yes, you can ask. But I would be, sort of careful about how you do it. Next question. How do US professors know Indian GPA? Interesting question. How do we take into account GPAs in other countries where the GPA system is different? Well, In my case, I don't care about GPA a whole lot, so I frankly don't pay a ton of attention. Um, uh, so I've never encountered this before. Uh, so the answer to this is you can look, right? Like it, it's easy enough to find out what, GPA ranges are in other places and what's considered a good GPA in other places, and then decide how to weigh that. I would imagine that really large programs that do, admissions that are based somewhat on data, they probably have some kind of like calculator. Like this is equivalent to this. But then there's sort of a broader question. So you're also saying the question here, like you say some university give basically higher GPAs and some are very strict. So this isn't a question about India. This is a question about, in general, how do you weigh GPAs at different universities when you know that some universities are really, really hard and they're known for like not giving a bunch of high GPAs. And so how do you take that into account? And the answer is it's part of that holistic thing, right? And this is the other reason why I think that any kind of like numerical admissions algorithm is stupid, because like because these numbers are just numbers, right? Like they don't, I mean, you can use it to maybe like I don't know, some kind of like vague cutoff, or to give you a sense of like places you should look more closely at someone's application or that sort of thing. But like, yeah, numbers are just numbers. But if someone, people know universities or could ask about universities, and yeah, it's all part of the sort of holistic process, I guess. But honestly, I don't even know. I don't know that like big name schools necessarily are harder either. Anyway, so I guess that's my answer. Is that it's part of the like holistic thing, and people know universities that might be harder or easier or whatever if they care. And if they care that much about GPAs, they're going to be paying a lot more attention to this than I am, frankly. So there might be particular ways that people are taking those things into account. Is university rating/ranking important for choosing a PhD program? I'm glad you asked this. This is a hard question, and I will give you my perspective on this, while acknowledging that my perspective is not the same as everyone else's. Um, and okay, but I also want to preface this by saying there are different ways of thinking about ranking when it comes to a PhD program. When you say ranking here, I'm going to use that as a synonym for prestige. Since rank, like if people know that, like, so if you're only looking at, say, like US News and World Report rankings or whatever, like consider that sort of useless. The way those rankings work aren't that important. But if you want to think about it as a proxy for prestige, there's the prestige of the university, there's the prestige of the program, and there's the prestige, especially in STEM and social science and fields where you work very closely with an advisor, the prestige of the advisor, right? Three totally different kinds of prestige. I would say that out of all of those, the prestige of the university is probably the least important when it comes to things like getting a job. It might be important for things like you want to sound cool at cocktail parties, or like, later in your career, you can imagine someone like announcing you in your bio and you have a PhD from X university. Sure, those things can matter, but it's probably not going to be as big of a deal, the prestige of the university, as is the prestige of the program. Sometimes there are these like amazingly well-known, like very good programs that are like in a university that isn't as high. And that's just because, like, I mean, all kinds of reasons. Like, a university is not a monolith, and universities are known for some things and not known for other things. And there are some big name universities that that have a, a small, like, are not known for certain things, right? Like, I mean, if I think about my field and I think about, like, say the big conference in my field, like the most prestigious place to publish, there are some big name universities that I have never seen published there, right? Like really big name universities. And if I saw, like, someone from that university applying for a job in this field, I would be like, oh, that's interesting. But it wouldn't be a plus one, because, like, to their application necessarily, because, like, that university isn't known in that field. Does that make sense? I hope I'm explaining that well. Um, and then, of course, and then again, there's the prestige of the individual advisor, which also can make a big difference. Again, in some fields, especially. Um, the other thing that I would say is that, um, as a PhD student, you have the opportunity to do a lot of things that are going to make you stand out. Um, in ways that you don't as an undergrad or a master's student, right? So, like, when you're an undergrad or a master's student, like, you take classes and you get A's and maybe, do extracurriculars, and sometimes you can do cool things like write a thesis or whatever, and these are the things that are determining how good you look for your next steps. For a PhD student, the main thing that is being looked at for, like, an academic job is what you publish and the research that you output. Um, and so someone who has a PhD from, name whatever you think is the most prestigious university in the world, and they haven't published anything, or their publications are bad, or their research is bad, that's the fact that they went to big name university is not in any way going to, like, outweigh that. Um, and so so you should go somewhere where you can do the kind of research that you're excited about and that you want to do. Now, but I say that I'm not going to pretend that there's, like, no elitism anywhere in academia. And so, all things being equal, you've got, like, Ivy League here with a really good program that people care a lot about, and you've got, like, less prestigious university here that also has a really good program, and you could be fine either way. Then, like, all things being equal, like, sure, go to the big name, absolutely. Things rarely are equal, I guess. And so I guess I encourage people to not choose solely based on the prestige, especially of the university. Disclaimer, I'm, like, at a big state university, and I'm sure that people choose to go to, MIT or Harvard or whatever instead of us all the time for this reason, and maybe they're better off for it. I don't know. But this is my opinion also as someone who looks at academic job applications sometimes. But again, my opinion, this is one of those things where people are definitely going to feel differently. Okay, next question. Got into a PhD program in the US without funding. How do you go about it in terms of getting funded? Um, Sent a private message to the prof. They indicated it's uncommon for someone to get a PhD admission without funding in their program. Huh, interesting. So I don't know if you were here earlier when I addressed this a little bit. So let me give a sort of shorter answer. If you are admitted into a program without funding, you should make a decision about whether to go there with the assumption that you will not have funding. Just because that is always a possibility. And you can't get mad if you don't have funding and they told you that you wouldn't have funding, or you might not have funding, right? Um, if you're making it, but it is completely reasonable that if you are making a decision, that is important, right? Like, no one is going to fault you for asking questions about the odds that you will get funding or mechanisms through which you get funding, because that is an absolutely important thing that you should be considering as part of that decision. And so I cannot imagine anyone getting mad at you for asking these questions, right? So I think you should ask questions about what mechanisms there are to get funding, how likely it is, and these kinds of things, like, with not of students, but, like, of whoever's running the program. Like ask whoever's in charge of admissions or whatever. But those are completely reasonable questions to ask. And I can't give you a question. I can't give you an answer about whether you should go or not. Again, this is very personal, but you should get as much information as possible. Next question. Admitted into a PhD program, but the professor of interest is currently on parental leave. Is it appropriate to reach out and schedule a meeting with them before you make a decision? Excellent question. And as someone on sabbatical this year, not as good of a reason as being on parental leave. Like I'm just on sabbatical, so I'm sort of around. But some students reached out to me at various points, and I made it clear that it was totally, I was willing to have meetings with them. So you should absolutely reach out, right? The worst they can say is no or not respond, and they may very well not respond, and this is a good reason to to not respond. I think a question that I would ask is when you say professor of interest, were you do you have reason to think that that will be because you were admitted? Like in our program, we put your incoming advisor on the admissions letter. Like you are admitted to work with a person. Now, it could change, but you're admitted to work with a person. If that's the case, then you absolutely should reach out, and I would anticipate that they probably would respond to you. If that's not the case, and there's some chance that like they don't actually know who you are, or like it's just someone that you want to work with, but you don't know, if they were involved in admissions or stuff at all, then you can still reach out, but I would have less expectation that you would get a response. The other thing you could do is reach out to like the director of the graduate program or something like that, and just ask them this question. Like, do you know if this person would it be appropriate for me to reach out to this person? I see that they're on parental leave. But in general, like you can always reach out. You just like, can't necessarily assume that you're going to get a response. And I wouldn't take it as a bad thing if you don't. Next question. In an application, when they ask you, do you need funding? You marked as yes. But if someone says no, that mean they're in PhD program students are not paid. I do not have any experience with unfunded PhD programs. So I just don't know the answer to this. My hope would be that no, your answer to this question does not matter at all. But I cannot tell you that because I just have absolutely no experience with how admission works for programs that are not funded for everyone. Okay, next question. I don't know whether I'm suitable for studying for a PhD or not. I feel excited and finding ideas and developing them, but when research project is stuck, you're frustrated. It is, of course, frustrating. I mean, this is frustrating for everyone, even PhD students. If you have, it sounds like you have some kind of research experience already. If you've been, if you already know that you have these feelings, and so I obviously can't answer this for you at all. I think I would just encourage you, like if this was your life for the next 5 years, how would you feel about it, right? I mean, I think you can assume that things would be somewhat different than what you're doing now, when you're in a PhD program, that you're learning to do new things, and that's going to make a difference. But I wouldn't assume that like sometimes getting frustrated by research means you're not cut out for a PhD program. But only you can answer this. Like how would it be if you felt like this for the next 5 years? And how do you weigh the sort of excitement versus the frustration? All right, next question. I think this is which one of these should I pick? One, a professor with a matching research interest and an opportunity to publish together, but without a lot of money. Or two, a professor with good funding, a project, but lack of theory match and publishing support. So my first question would be, are you still funded either way? So when you talk about so if this were a question in my PhD program, like let's say that two of our professors, and this was what the question looked like, what that would mean would be there's someone who it's likely that I can get a research assistantship and be paid to work on research, and the other one would be I'm going to have to teach for a while because they don't personally have funding. So that's different than like I might have to get student loans if I work with this professor, right? So I think that this is an easier question, or I feel like I can tell you how I would think about this if you are actually funded either way, right? If this is a case where you're thinking about an unfunded position versus a funded position, then like that's very different and a very reasonable thing for you to take into account. And I can't answer how important that is to you. Um, but if they're actually both funded, um, then it I feel like you should go where the research match. I mean, I don't want to. Well, again, uh, everyone has very different priorities, right? Super different priorities. I cannot tell you what your priorities are. Um, I can tell you that for me, it seems like getting to do the kind of research that you want to do um, is like feels like the important thing, especially like and publish. And when you say like getting to publish versus not getting to publish, like that, oh, this seems so much like a kind of obvious thing to me that I think I'm probably missing something. And maybe the thing that I'm missing is that like this determines whether you can pay your rent or not, in which case that's hugely different. So yeah, I mean, so I guess the only thing I can tell you is like you should think about what your priorities are. um Next question. Does the political climate and foreign policy of the US government determine PhD admissions? No. Like I feel pretty confident in that answer. Yeah, I feel pretty confident in that answer. I mean, the political climate, visas and stuff, um, can end up having an impact on students who are admitted, right? Like if you end up not, and this actually did happen um in our program a few years ago. Like someone was admitted and and this was also during COVID, so things were really weird. Like they ended up not being able to travel to this country, but it was like also COVID weird stuff. um so like but I can't imagine ways in which that would impact admissions, right? I guess the only advice I would give you here is that like it might, if there's some possibility based on your knowledge of the situation that you're going to have trouble getting a US visa, you should apply to programs in other countries as well, like as backups if you have that opportunity. um um let's see. I see something where I don't really see a question, so I'm going to skip to the next one. Is a good PhD always strong on publishing, and should a record of a PI's publication be considered when choosing a supervisor? It's so is it when you say a good PhD, I assume you mean like potential for a job after PhD. There's lots of ways you could uh like metric what a good PhD is, right? Like how's your work life balance or whatever, right? Okay. But let's say it's ability to get a job afterwards. um Publishing is important, but it's not everything. But also publishing is going to look different for different people, right? I mean, I talk to my students about this all the time. Like in my field, methods are so like drastically different, that like a machine learning researcher is going to publish way more than an ethnographer. Like that's just how it happens. Like different types of work take different amounts of time. um so like how much you and also like you can publish bad stuff and publish a whole lot of it, and you can publish one really good paper, right? So I just preface this by saying that like what is publishing? It's it's you should do good work. um but like doing good, so the ability to do good work is very important. But when you say like a record of a PI's publishing, like you might get, if you get a brand new assistant professor as your advisor, obviously like they're not going to have published as much as someone who's been a full professor for a decade. um so I think the question you should ask is, will I be able to do good work with this person? Like, are they doing work that I'm excited about, even if they haven't published it yet? You might ask questions like, are they publishing with their students, if that's something that you would be doing? But that's kind of hard to give a clear answer to. Can I do a session in April? I will think about it. Maybe. I mean, honestly, like when you get much later than this, it ends up being not super helpful for people, I think. But maybe in April, like when people are having to make final decisions. So yeah, I can probably do one more. Um, Next question. I currently have a non-research master's and work in industry, nor no formal research experience, but you work with data a lot. How would you transition from an industry career to a PhD? Um, you should have a good story for why you want to get a PhD, right? And actually, transitioning, in sort of like the computing world, for example, transitioning from like working, say, as a data scientist at a company into getting a PhD, there's usually a very good story for that, right? Like why you're interested in research and why it's important and how the work that you've done has made you want to explore these kinds of things. There actually tends to be I think a really good story there. And so you need to figure out what that story is for you. But I think something like someone who's worked in industry and computer science, might have done things and have types of experience that I think outweighs some of the like, oh, you don't have like formal research experience kind of thing. I think that you can usually tell a really good story there. Next question. Do you think reaching out to professors to introduce yourself after submitting the application could be beneficial to increase chances of getting admitted? So I'm not going to say no here because I am not everyone and I don't know how everyone thinks about this and maybe it's helpful. Um, I I personally don't see the point in doing that, but that's because again, I see reaching out to a prospective advisor as a fact-finding mission for you and not like something to help you get. I mean, it could help you. It can help you with your application in the sense that you will find out things that will help you write a good application, right? Like what that person is doing now and whether they're accepting new students and whether they think you should be talking to someone else instead. So like a student reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, I submitted an application. And I just wanted you to know." My response is like, cool, I look forward to seeing it. But it doesn't change anything because I have their application, right? Like, is there information that you are providing that is not in the application? Um, in which case, like, it probably should have been if it's relevant. Um, that said, again, I'm not really totally familiar with like norms in other fields. And just as I'm aware in some fields, reaching out to faculty at all is kind of unusual. It might be that, I'm sort of in a field that's kind of in the middle, and then there are other fields where like you're really supposed to. So I would ask this question of someone in your field. But for me, I would think about like what your goal is, right? What's the point? And then, but also like I can't see a way in which that would be taken badly. Like if someone does reach out to me and says like, "Hey, I submitted an application, just wanted you to know," I just responded, I'm like, "Cool, looking forward to seeing it." It doesn't reflect badly. I'm just sort of like, I can't help you at this point. You know what I mean? All right, next question. Does TOEFL score matter for PhD like it does in MS? Sometimes TAs depend on TOEFL. At my university, there is a university minimum TOEFL score. And I don't actually know what that is. But it's like that's the requirement for admitted students at the university, and that is what I look at. And if it's above that, then cool. And that's all I care about. I mean, that's all the department cares about, really. I do think that there could be minimums for like TAs and stuff, and maybe so. I don't know that this has not come up in my department, so I'm not familiar with what that's like. Um, if that's the case, but I would think the rules around that would be fairly clear, if that's the case. But as long as your scores, whatever they are, meet whatever minimum is required, I don't know that it would, matter. But and again, and you have ways to, show your English language proficiency in like your statement of purpose and also like talking to people, should you get an interview or that sort of thing, if there are interviews. Next question. What to do if you haven't heard back from programs yet? Should you reach out to the grad department? No. if you haven't heard back, it means there isn't a decision yet. I mean, if there's a way for you to like double check, like I know that our university has some kind of like portal, and like when you submit your application, you can log in and it'll give you a status. So it'll say like pending. Um, so uh yeah, so and until it gets to the point where like so okay, so there are so my first question would be like, is there a reason that it matters right now? um like, have you been admitted into a program and you need to make a decision, but you don't know if you've gotten into this other program yet? um and is there a time frame in which that becomes a problem? And if that's the case, then it is totally fine to reach out and say, um hey, it looks as if there hasn't been a decision yet. I have, this other offer and I do need to make a decision, and so I was I'm trying to figure out timelines, and so I was hoping that you could give me an ETA. Um, I think that would be fine. That is a totally reasonable request. That said, for most programs in the U.S., at least, you're not required to give anyone a decision before April 15th. Um, you, the applicant. Um, but I don't think it's super weird if you haven't heard back yet. So, and if it's just that if it's just that you like want to know, uh, you can, I would say just wait. You should get an actual, if you have been rejected, you should get a rejection though. Now, I'm not going to promise that like every program is like on the ball. Right? And I'm sure that things fall through the cracks. And so one thing is that if you get to a point where like you haven't heard anything and it's getting to be decision, like I would say like in the US where there's that April 15th deadline, if you haven't gotten a decision by April 1st, like that would be a pretty reasonable time to reach out. But I wouldn't assume anything. I mean, obviously, like the longer time goes, the less likely it is, and a good probably. But even that, like sometimes there's just delays for lots of different reasons. And sometimes it means that you're lingering on this sort of like unofficial wait list. So it also could be a good sign if you haven't gotten I mean, anything that isn't a rejection yet, right? So I wouldn't assume that silence is a rejection. A rejection is a rejection. All right. Next question. In terms of admission, are domestic applicants treated equally as international students? Yes. I don't really have more to say than that. And in my experience, like 100% the same. It seriously doesn't matter at all. Next question. Do you notice PhD applicants using ChatGPT in their statement of purpose? No, I have not noticed this, though as a caveat, I'm on sabbatical this year. So this is the first year in 7 years that I have not personally run admissions in my department. So that means that the only statements of purpose I read for our applicants this year were applicants that mentioned me. Or that someone else told me I should look at. I did not look at, for example, applicants who got desk rejected. I did not see their applications. So there's certainly a non-zero chance that we desk rejected some ChatGPT statements of purpose, but I don't know. And also, like, how would you know? I mean, anyway, if any of you follow me on TikTok, you've seen me like ranting about AI detectors. So I don't care if something is written by AI. Personally, I care if it sucks, which stuff written by AI often sucks. So, but I will also say, while I'm on this topic, be very careful about having ChatGPT write a statement of purpose for you, because I tried it. This is one of the things that I did back in like the fall of 2022. I had ChatGPT write statements of purpose for our PhD program, and it started doing some weird stuff. So just be aware. Next question. Can we get an advance on your stipend to assist with moving costs? All you can do is ask. often, usually if something like that is possible, you will know. Like, usually that will be a thing that they will do if they know that they can do that. But like, that's the sort of thing that, is a reasonable question. Just know that the answer could very well, it's like, frankly, it's probably likely to be no. I mean, I'll tell you that it's at some departments at my university, students are given a fellowship to help. Like, there's some money. Some departments have more money than others, of course, but like sometimes there's money where like you get this like $1,000 fellowship when you start, and you can use it however you want. Most people use it for moving expenses. But you can ask. It's not an unreasonable question, but like, probably, if they haven't said anything, the answer is gonna be no. I'm an undergrad applying to PhD next year. You've been doing research, published a couple of papers, with one being a first author. Got 2 research interns. So I think your question is, you've got an internship, but the project is not interesting, and you've got another internship, but you're passionate about it, and so I'm assuming not as prestigious. So you're asking about you're asking about how to choose an undergrad, like research experience during an undergrad, when it comes to like prestige. I mean, I personally would do the thing you find interesting, because that's going to get you excited about research, which is going to be, and you'll be more likely to like continue to be excited and do the things you're passionate about, and like apply for PhD programs that are in what you're passionate about. And when you do good work that you're passionate about, you're likely to get good letters of recommendation. So like, why would you do something that you're not passionate? I mean, so the argument here from the elitist would say, go to CMU, do a good job, because you'll get a letter of recommendation from someone with a big name. And like, okay, I mean, it's possible that could help. I personally would not consider that a good trade. Like, for me, that would not have been a good trade-off. I don't want to do something that I'm not interested in for an entire summer, just so that one of my letters of recommendation has a slightly bigger name on it. But again, people's priorities are different. And I also say this in my letter of recommendation video, that when you're choosing people to write you letters of recommendation, what they say is more important than who they are. And I say this because I remember so clearly a particular letter of recommendation that came into her. And this was someone we ended up admitting and like did a great job and all that. But like, I still remember this letter. Like, there was a letter of recommendation from this big name in our field, like, luminary of the field, like, didn't actually write a textbook, but you can imagine like the person who wrote the textbook. And the letter of recommendation was a paragraph long, and it basically said, this student took my class, they got an A in my class, here's what my class is about. Based on this class, I'm sure they would be a good graduate student. So like, this was someone who didn't know them. Clearly, it was probably a 300-person class, and the fact that they got an A on it, I could have seen on their transcript, right? This was a completely useless letter of recommendation, like, throw it out the window, told me nothing, despite this big name, right? And I hope that I mean, again, they got in, so like, it wasn't a big deal, but like, and they had other good letters, but like, I would hope that they didn't choose that person to write them a letter instead of someone who could have said, oh my God, this student is amazing. They've done this research project. They were so passionate about it. Here's all this amazing stuff they did, right? So, I would keep that in mind as well. But this is, again, back to like, different people have different priorities, and I don't know what yours are. So I can't help you, really make this decision. But, my personal advice tends to be follow your passion, but there are lots of other things you should take into account as well. So going back to the like reaching out to a professor afterwards, and they said the goal is that they might remember you as someone passionate about the program when selecting applications. I mean, maybe, but like, can't you like, doesn't that passion come across in your statement of purpose? Like, if it doesn't, then that feels like more of a problem to me. But again, I can't see any way in which this is negative. Like, I don't know that it helps you, but I also don't think that it would reflect negatively on anyone to, reach out. Though I will say, if you're asking me this now, I know there are different timelines, but if this was an application that was due back in like December or January, like they're probably well into reviewing applications by now, like well into. Next question. If your research interests match an associate professor and also an emeritus, which experience do you think is better? Doesn't emeritus mean that they're not actively a professor anymore? Usually an emeritus professor is like someone who's retired. And so they would not be an advisor. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe this word means something different in different contexts. But I'll answer in general, like let's say, let me answer this a different way. What if you have the choice between like a brand new assistant professor and a tenured professor? Pros and cons, right? Total pros and cons. I mean, when you say your research interests match both of them, they're probably not actually equal, right? Like they're either slightly different. Like there's going to be something else besides their rank that's going to help you make this decision. I do have a program. I do have a whole video about choosing advisors and like questions you might want to ask an advisor. So maybe that would help. But like pros and cons of like brand new hungry assistant professor and like tenured professor. The tenured professor might be like more well known. Maybe that's helpful, good for like networking and stuff. They also might not be quite as like, I don't want to say not as driven, but like untenured professors need to publish, right? Like they need to. Tenured professors don't need to. They want to, and that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that they're gonna like not work, hard for their. I actually think I don't actually think that rank really matters that much. Like there's kinds of pros and cons, and even those aren't like across the board anyway. Like everyone's different. I would just go with whichever one seems like you like them the best and are the best fit. Can you give advice on how to personalize statements of purpose for different universities? I do talk about this a bit in my statement of purpose video, I think. But it should, like, most of the time it's going to be faculty. If it's in a like STEM or social science field where you work very closely with a faculty advisor, it's usually important to mention potential faculty advisors, in which case that's the obvious way. But even in programs where you wouldn't be working as closely with an advisor, it still makes sense to mention specific faculty as like sort of a benchmark for the kind of work that's happening there. So that's like the low-hanging fruit. Yeah. Next question, recommendations on how to get into research in social science humanities outside of a PhD. Well, in social science humanities, sometimes this is the kind of stuff you can sort of do on your own. So I have a video about things to do if you are rejected from all the PhD programs you apply to, and like that your application is that you sort of did the right things in your applications, and so there's something that maybe could make your application stronger. And so one of those is like, you don't have research experience. What do I do now? I'm out of school. And it has some suggestions in there, and one of them was like, what if you started blogging? I mean, I feel like I don't feel great about suggesting that people like do a bunch of sort of free labor and that sort of thing. But if you're excited about an area, then like, and you want to do something that looks like researchy kind of writing, like let's say you're in media studies. Like what if you started a blog? What if you started making TikToks or writing op-eds or something like that? Like I'm not going to promise that these things are going to help, but that's sort of what comes to mind for that kind of thing in like humanities. And again, and lots of reasons you wouldn't want to do this, but I always say, like, if you don't get into PhD programs and you have the capacity to do this, and it's not going to like ruin your life financially or whatever, the obvious next step is to get a master's degree. Like, it's just all the things that can make a PhD application better, you can probably get out of a master's degree. That said, lots of reasons you might not want to do that. Finances probably being the number one. Next question. My major in college is biomedical engineering and research interests is computational biology. Should you apply to BME PhD programs? I cannot answer this for you. I'm sorry. This is one of those questions where I have absolutely no answer for you at all. You just need to decide what's right for you, and maybe talk to some people in your field about the pros and cons of each of these. I have extensive experience in blockchain development, not to mention, I heard many professors don't have positive feelings about what blockchain. I don't know. I don't think I have an opinion on this. Yeah, I wouldn't be like concerned about like something on your resume looking weird to people, or I wouldn't be concerned about this. Someone says, I did most research in a paper and it went into your master's thesis. For some reason, you're third author in a paper. Should you put it in the resume or how to mention it? Okay. So I think what you're saying here is you did a ton of work on a project, but you ended up being the third author on the paper. If everything you say here is true, this troubles me, and I feel like you were perhaps wronged in some way. But also, there are there are also sometimes times when like a master's student might do a bunch of the research, but then a lot of the intellectual work happens from someone else, or maybe like someone else writes the paper. There are all kinds of things that could have happened here, so I'm not going to assume. But the point is, it goes on your resume as it is accurately, where you are in the author order, and then you talk about it in your statement of purpose, and be prepared to talk about it with like, people like, when I talk about not needing publications, one of the reasons that I say that is because whether something has been published and where you are in the author order is not the important thing. The important thing is the work that you did. So like, I know I've ranted about this before, but I find it utterly absurd that like, a publication is somehow more valuable than like a research project, because it takes a long time for a research project to become a publication. And so you should talk about what you did, and be prepared to answer questions about it if that comes up, and that sort of thing. And so yeah, I would, you should just be honest. Is it okay to ask the professor you're reaching out to about both PhD positions and research assistant positions? So my question is, are you asking about PhD programs outside the United States? Because things work differently. Especially in Europe, sometimes you're like applying to a position, right? You're not applying, like, you're applying to a particular like PhD program opening, and it's like a whole it's like a research position and a PhD acceptance all in one kind of thing. I don't know a ton about that. So I don't know the answer to this. I'm going to interpret this question as I would interpret it if it were in a US PhD program, kind of like mine. In which case, this question doesn't totally make sense. But it might in other contexts. So I've got this whole video about like how funding in PhD programs work, at least in my experience. And I posted this video a few years ago, and no one's told me that like it's incredibly wrong. So I think it's fairly accurate to how a lot of things work, at least in the United States. In which case, like, you're admitted into a PhD program, and then your funding comes from where it comes from, right? Like maybe you happen to like have a research assistantship position, but anyway, basically those two things are unrelated. And in my program, at least, Um, uh, Most students are teaching assistants at the beginning, just because, frankly, first year PhD students just like there's so much going on, and like you're just not going to get a ton of research done, and I don't expect you to get a ton of research done. But for that reason, I would rather have a more senior student, not a research assistantship. um yeah, I guess I mean, you can always ask like how funding works in that department, and how research assistant positions are doled out, and that sort of thing. um so I hope that answer made sense. You could always ask that question also of like the graduate director, like how does funding work in that department. um what is the typical time frame to hear back on admissions in the US? If you haven't heard back from a program in a month, is that a bad sign? No, that is not a bad sign at all. Um, a month is nothing. Our Okay, I will tell you the timeline of my program in case this is helpful. Our applications are due December 1st. Okay, also like winter break happens during here. So there's like this, 2 or 3 week time in which nothing happens. But like even then, admission, like they come in, it takes a few weeks to sort of turn everything into spreadsheets, and then it takes a few weeks for everything to be reviewed, and then people start reaching out to people for interviews and that sort of thing. And anyway, our decisions, like, usually tend to be like 2 months ish after, 2.5. I don't know, something like that. But no, I wouldn't worry about a month. um the only thing that's relevant to the US in particular is that this is like a decision of like the graduate council, or I don't even know how schools become members of this, but for a lot, but not all programs in the US, April 15th is the earliest date by which programs can ask students for decisions. The reason they do this is so that a program can, so because this would, like, think about how like crappy this would be. So you get admitted into a PhD program, and they say you have 1 week to decide whether you're going to accept our offer. And then you're screwed because there's all these other places you haven't heard back from yet. So the Council of Graduate Schools, I think that's who did this, was like, you can't do that, graduate programs. You all have to give everyone at least until April 15th to make a decision, because that way you can definitely have all your decisions. Like you can have all of your admissions, and then you can make an informed decision. So because of that, a lot of programs will give decisions, early enough that you can then make a reasonable decision by April 15th. But in theory, that doesn't even force them to give you decisions by then. But I would say that, like, now is around the time when you start hearing back from places, or earlier. But also, again, only a rejection is a rejection. If you haven't heard back from somewhere, it is a no. There is no decision yet. Okay, lightning round. I'm going to try to get through as many more questions as I can in the next 10 minutes. But if I end up not getting to all of them when it comes to 10 to the hour, please leave them in the comments on this video, and I will answer them in the comments. Okay. Mechanical engineering student, don't know if you'd be a good fit for a PhD program. Is it possible to get full funding for? So, is it possible to get full funding for a master's program? Yes. It is typically not promised, though. I mean, I had funding the entire time I was a master's student. I was lucky. That was not a promise to me. It was like sometimes this happens. Same thing in the PhD program in the master's program in my department. Funding is not promised. Sometimes students get funding. I don't even know what the percentage is right now. But a reasonable question for you to ask, when you're admitted into master's programs, or even when you're researching them, is what are mechanisms by which master's students get funding? And, if you can tell me, what is the percentage of students that tend to get funding? There also might be some fully funded master's programs. I just can't think of any off the top of my head. How important to have unique ideas about research? Finding new things is challenging. There's so many new things, right? I mean, if there were no new things, there would be no dissertations. I mean, that said, I think that there is an over focus on novelty, at least in my field. like when you do something new, it is new, right? Like not everything has to be 100% novel all the time. Um, and frankly, we have a replication crisis. So like replicate away. So I wouldn't over focus on that. I would think about the things that interest you, and usually things that interest you are new things, right? Like you have ideas. What is the next question to ask? But that doesn't mean that you're doing something 100%. I mean, honestly, if you were doing something so you like 100% unique, you'd have a hard time finding an advisor because no one would be doing what you wanted to do. um, uh, Uploaded a paper to archive and have submitted it to a journal, but they haven't replied. How do you write it in your CV? You write it as under submission. You can even say under submission to blank, the journal. Last question. Good. In my final semester, master's in history, writing a dissertation. What do I suggest? You want to do research in something different? My advice for if you want to do research in a slightly different area than what you're doing now is that you just need to be able to tell a little bit of a story about there to here, right? Like, how are they related? Why are you interested in this new thing? Like that's the basic approach. Okay, one more question. I think this is a quick one. When is the best time to approach professors for a TA? That completely depends on how TA assignments happen in that department. In my department, this is not a thing that you would do because TA assignments are made by the department and not by the professor that teaches the class. So you should find out how that works and whether it's appropriate to even ask. Like what happens in my department is that, in the summer, like beginning of August or something, our department admin sends all the PhD students a form and it's like, tell us what classes you want to TA. And then they assign them. So it totally depends on how that works. There also may very well be some departments where the faculty member does pick their own TA. In fact, that might have happened where I was in grad school, come to think of it. Or sometimes there's like a combination. Sometimes they can like request or whatever. But yeah, you should find out how that works. All right. I got through it. Yeah, so if you're watching this later, please feel free. I can't believe you just watched an hour and 45 minutes of this, but I hope there was something helpful in here. But if you have more questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will answer the question or comment. I had a request if I could do another live stream at the beginning of April. So sure. I think I should be able to do that. In fact, maybe I'll go ahead and like pick a time and set it up so that there's plenty of like, lead time and that sort of thing. And then I'll probably go on a hiatus until, September. But thanks everyone. I wish you good luck. I will point you to a few different videos. If you are I have offers of admission to PhD. Have I read all these books? Almost certainly not all of them, no. If you are in the I have multiple PhD offers stage, I have a video on choosing between PhD programs, and I also have a video on choosing an advisor, which can be really important. And then if you already or sometime after this conversation have not been successful in PhD admissions this year, I also have a video on what to do if you are rejected. And I will, just a reminder that like, seriously, sometimes it is just luck and timing, and sometimes all you need to do is try again. But it, has some information about things that you might do to think about whether that's the case and whether you want to try again, and if there are things that you could do to make your application stronger or that sort of thing. And then also, I have a video on what to do the summer before you start your PhD, which the short answer is nothing. Enjoy your summer, do absolutely nothing, but if you absolutely must do something, it has some suggestions. Anyway, thanks everyone for hanging out. I wish you all the very best of luck, and I will see you next time. Bye.